Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Commission, Secretary Vonk. Sorry, Andy and I are kind of caught off guard here. We were expecting to do this later this afternoon. So today we're going to give you a little bit of an update on the elk season proposals and where we're going with those, as well as the survey data that you've probably heard a lot about and that we gave you a brief summary on at the last meeting. I'm also going to touch briefly on the push that we did with Wind Cave there. And I'll start with that. Just to update you and complete that picture for you, you remember last month that I gave you an update on the initial push where we pushed close to 200 animals out the north there into Custer State Park. So we did do another push. Actually, the Friday that the commission meeting ended last month, we went down to Wind Cave and pushed more elk. So what we ended up with was a total of 389 elk that we pushed north into Custer State Park. Predominantly, we pushed them through these buffalo corrals here, which, like I told you last month, proved to be a nice asset there because these elk were pretty difficult to push through the fence. And just as a reminder, this pink line down here, and I apologize, this is kind of small, but this pink line down here outlines Wind Cave National Park. And these lines here is Custer State Park, butting up on the north there to Wind Cave National Park. And so most of those elk, as I mentioned, did go through the buffalo corrals. And then we were able to push about 150 elk through this northeast corner here of Wind Cave National Park, where we took some fence down. Mostly cows and calves. We did have about 25 branch antlered bulls or mature bulls that we pushed through. And 26 of the elk that went through had radio collars. So those were radio collars that Wind Cave National Park put out as part of their research. And part of their research is to evaluate this push out of the park and determine where those elk go and movement and mortality once they're outside of the park. And so those collars, along with the collars that we already have out from our research here in Custer State Park, will be very important to monitor the success of this push over the next year here. I can tell you that these elk are predominantly hanging in the south end of the park here. We would like to see them go further north into Custer State Park and set up residency there, if you will. We did find out the other day that it does appear that we have a few elk going out the southwest corner of Custer State Park here. The staff there has actually been able to shore up that fence, so we don't think any more will go out there. And it's not such a bad thing that they're heading out to the west there. That is into the north half of Unit 3 and a spot where we could use some more elk, so that'll be okay. And as far as future plans, we're going to discuss, staff will discuss over the next year whether we would like to push more elk out of Wind Cave, and if so, where would they go? Wind Cave does want to get down to about 250 to 450 elk, and so we'll talk about some of those numbers later, but they still are a bit above their population objective. So we'll talk about this over the next year and bring you plans late this year as to what we intend to do next year. Next, I'd like to show, we did put together just a short video of the elk push and just to give you an idea what we're up against there and how these elk reacted to the helicopter and stuff, and thought this might be of interest to you. And it's kind of small, but as you can see, here's a big group of elk that we're pushing here. So we did use 2 helicopters, and basically what we did is one helicopter would steer the herd, if you will, and the other would stay behind and just keep the herd moving. So you'll see in some of this video, some of these helicopters are, he's really banking here. So this helicopter is steering the elk, and some could say scattering the elk. But then the other helicopters, they would switch roles. As I mentioned last month, it can be difficult. You'll see in some of this video here, you see an elk shooting back there. We're trying to cut them off. They really did not want to go through this fence. And so once we're getting close to the fence here, and those elk started to change their minds. So you see that those helicopters really start to maneuver and get those elk balled up. And eventually, as you'll see here, this big group will shoot through the corner of the fence here. And this is those buffalo corrals that they use to herd the buffalo up, as I mentioned in the previous slide there. And there we go. So big group of elk shooting through the fence there, and they'll make a right turn here and head up into Custer State Park. These guys are pretty good at what they do. They know how to use these helicopters and make them work for what we need done. So just another couple shots. We're working on our video skills. These are GoPro cameras that we strapped on the outside of the helicopter, and some of this works really well, and other stuff we're learning some lessons on. Again, this does show the difficulty. You can see we've got elk. Not all of them want to go in that big ball and head the way we'd like to see them go, so it can be pretty difficult to keep them moving. So this helicopter is going to go up and steer that group again, try and push it a different way. As I mentioned last month, the bulls proved to be the toughest to push. Once they got into the trees and or close to that fence again, and you can see here that bull even tried to shoot right through the fence. They were really difficult to push. Just quickly, this is a brief clip. If you watch right down here, this is part of the Elk Survey. We just wanted to give you a little taste of what it looks like to observe these elk out of the helicopter. Andy's going to talk to you about the Elk Survey and some of those challenges and what goes into the model. But again, this is kind of small, but keep your eye right here. You'll see there is a group of elk in these trees, and this does demonstrate some of the difficulties of observing those elk in that canopy cover and getting a count and classifying those animals. Again, I apologize for the quality of the video. We'll have better stuff in the future. Okay, I think we could probably go back to the PowerPoint, please, Chris.
Good afternoon. It's a little awkward not being able to look at you when we talk here, so I guess you can look at the back of my head, but maybe throw something at me if you want to ask a question in the middle of my presentation. We can sure stop as we go along here. John and I put together some information on a couple updates from our elk surveys. In particular, we want to talk about our aerial elk survey first here. And I know all of you are aware that we did a survey this year of our elk from the air. And I want to emphasize this was really a monumental effort. We had 20 staff involved in this effort. We spent over 170 hours in the air actually counting animals when you count the ferry time. We were over 200 hours in the helicopters. We had 2 helicopters here from a contractor, Quicksilver, and we spent about a month doing this. And really, this is the first time in the history of our department we've ever surveyed the entire Black Hills. So this was really a significant effort, and this will be an important point when people look back at the history of elk management in the state. So we're really excited to talk about some of the things we saw this year. So before I get into the results, I want to talk a little bit about siteability models just to give everybody a taste for what we're trying to do here with our aerial survey. Now, aerial surveys and siteability models for elk have been around for more than 20 years. We're not the first ones to invent this, obviously. It was first, I think the first paper on elk aerial surveys and a model was back in the late 1980s, so they've been around a while. But one of the reasons that we do aerial surveys and develop these models is because there's been a lot of research out there that shows us we cannot see all the animals. In fact, here's the range. Usually we're missing 10 to 70% of the animals out there when we're trying to count them from the air. So there's a lot of animals that go unseen during our surveys, despite our attempts. So how we deal with that is we develop a siteability model to estimate how many of those animals we actually miss. And we do that by calculating detection probabilities of each of the groups we observe. Now, these detection probabilities are basically models that are developed by flying over groups of animals that have radio collars, and then we record the covariates of both the observed animals we see and the ones we miss. And we've been doing this in South Dakota for a fair number of years here, and I'll get into a little bit of that here in a second. but we will record covariates such as snow cover or percent of vegetation cover, group size, things like that, of all those animals that we miss and the ones we see. And we know we miss them because we have radios in these areas. So we'll be flying a subunit, and we won't pick up a group because we know there's a radio in there. So we'll go back, find that group of animals, and we'll record those covariates for that group we missed. And we'll do that for the ones we see as well. And then we use logistic regression to model these covariates and figure out which ones are important in the group detection. Now in South Dakota, we've developed our models using 2 master's projects through South Dakota State University and about 3 years of data collection. We've also added an additional year. The Game Fish and Parks collected data on radio-collared animals to supplement those models and improve their performance. And we did validate this model last year in Wind Cave. This is an area where we felt that Wind Cave staff had a pretty good handle on how many animals they had within the park there. So this gave us a chance to fly it using our aerial survey techniques and to compare what they had for an estimate and ours, and they were both very close. So we felt comfortable with the model and how it was performing in the Black Hills. Overall siteability from these 4 years of data collection and over 176 groups of animals with radio collars observed or missed, overall siteability was 60.8%. So in other words, we missed almost 40% of the animals out there when we're flying helicopter surveys, and I think that's important. Despite all of our efforts getting helicopters in here and flying 100%, we still missed about 40% of the animals. So our best model for elk in the Black Hills, and I mentioned these covariates we gathered before. Some of the covariates that we gathered to assess were group size. We looked at percent snow cover, vegetative obstruction basically. We also looked at activity of the animal. We tried to measure some light intensity variables. Those are some of the things we collected, but the ones that significantly affected siteability in the Black Hills were group size, percent vegetative cover, and snow cover. And so that's the model we're going to use. And that's the model that best predicts how many animals we miss and observe during our aerial survey. So that's probably a little bit more than you want to know about siteability models, but now I want to get in a little bit about the details of what we did for our aerial survey. We divided the hills into subunits that could be flown in about an hour. And you can see on this map here, the different colors are our different management units for elk in the hills. And all those little units in there are subunits, and we can fly each one of those in about an hour, some a little more, some a little less. We flew every single subunit in the hills, and we flew 100% of that subunit. We did that by, we had transects for about 200-300 meters apart. And when we're documenting this on a GPS in the helicopter, so we know areas we fly and don't fly. We're about 100 to 150 feet off the ground, 40-50 miles an hour. And for each observation, again, we recorded these covariates: vegetative cover, snow cover, and group size. But we also want to look at herd composition, so we recorded that, or at least we attempted to. And then we recorded the GPS coordinates so we could go back later and look at a map of these locations. We began our surveys on February 8th and ended March 6th. And here's a few more details I wanted to touch on regarding the specifics of our surveys. Now, we flew all of our subunits without spatial or temporal breaks as much as we could, except for times when we had bad weather days where we just absolutely could not get up in the air and fly. So in other words, we started our surveys in an area and systematically started chopping through those subunits. We didn't, for example, if I can get the red mark here, we didn't fly this one here and then hop down here and fly one there and there. We'd start here and start working the group all the way down. So we didn't have space in between them. And we also didn't want any day break in between them if we could. We flew straight through the weekends. We never took a day off until we were completed. And we had one chopper going almost all the time except for a few weather days. And when our other chopper wasn't capturing elk, we had it surveying. So a lot of times we had 2 choppers going at the same time. We did map all of our elk groups so that later we could go back and look on a map to see what some of these group counts were. For example, if we had one afternoon we had a group of 36 elk, and then the next morning, by golly, we counted another group of 36 elk right next to it. That might be one we'd consider removing because most likely, if they're really close, those probably the same group of elk. So we did go through some of our data that way and removed a few groups to prevent any type of double counts. Anytime we had a group that was larger than 50, we photographed it so we can get an accurate count of that group. So we go back and put it on the computer and actually pinpoint all those animals, so we had a good number. So we did some of those things to attempt to minimize any double counts, and at the same time we do know there were some group of elk we missed. For example, in Unit 9 we know we have a group of elk up there that's around 30 animals, because we have radio callers in that group. We know they were there during our survey, and we didn't count any elk in Unit 9, so we know we missed some elk out there. We missed some elk too on the first go around with the Custer State Park surveys. We had a pretty good group of elk we missed there, so we do know we missed some animals, but hopefully, well, not hopefully, that's what we used the model to correct for some of that. Am I blocked? So what do we see? I think just about everybody's seen this picture. It's become quite famous, or infamous, I guess, in some people's mind. But this is a picture of some elk we saw down in Unit 2. This was the largest herd we did see, and we saw some fairly large herds on winter and down there in Unit 2. But this herd itself was about 880 animals. It's a pretty amazing sight to see that big of a group of animals. Here's just another example of some animals. Obviously we got pretty close. We had them in the open. Hopefully nobody would miss this group of animals. But just to give you an idea, this is a group we took a picture of, went back and counted on the computer. I don't know anybody wants to take a quick stab at how many of those are, but take a guess, and then this is what we had. It was 124 animals right there, 82 cows, 34 calves, and 8 spikes. So it really was important to go back and put those on a computer and pinpoint every single one of them, because they can clump up pretty good together. This is what we counted. These are no estimates. These are our raw counts to give you an idea of where we saw animals in the Black Hills here. Obviously, our Unit 2, the Jasper Fire Burn area, that's where we saw the bulk of our animals. We're looking at over 3,000 animals in Unit 2 that we counted there. And then you can see some other places here in some of these subunits where we counted some smaller groups of animals.
Just another couple points there. The big group here, as an example of what Andy was talking about, where we tried to do this survey without a break in time or a break in counts, we counted this area down here with 2 helicopters in one day. So it's important to note that, because that does make us confident that we didn't double count down here. The other thing I would mention is that these are total numbers for the subunits, so these could be several groups added up for that subunit. It's not necessarily a single count for each unit.
Yeah, good point. Actually, on that down there, John said we flew that all in one day with 2 choppers, and they were in close communication with each other, so they knew where they were and where they were counting elk. And that first picture I showed of the helicopter in the air, that's actually taken out of another helicopter in that area when they're doing their surveys. So they were in close contact throughout the day there counting those animals. So here's what we have for estimates in the Black Hills. These are our modeled estimates. Obviously our major elk unit is Unit 2, and we're estimating we have about 3,800 animals there in Unit 2. Unit 3 would be our next biggest one, and that was close to 700 animals. I want to emphasize something here. These are winter elk concentrations and winter elk estimates. We know through research we have we have a fair number of elk migrating in the Black Hills, and a lot of these elk are migrating down to this Jasper Fire Burn area. So these are winter concentrations. They do not necessarily represent our fall hunting season concentration. So I think that's important to note. But obviously our Unit 2 unit is the main unit, and you can see some of these outer areas. Here's Unit 9 we talked about. We know we don't have 0 elk in there, but that's what we counted, so that's what we're gonna put on paper. But there are a few elk in Unit 9. So just to give you an idea of some of the raw numbers we counted. So Black Hills wide, not counting the parks, no model correction, we counted about 4,600 animals. Here's the breakup, you know, over 2,000 cows, 860 calves, some spikes, raghorns, and mature bulls, and about 1,100 unclassified. Of all these numbers, the bull number is probably the lowest when you look at our actual counts, because remember from some of our siteability modeling, we know that animals that are in smaller groups and are in vegetative cover, we miss a higher proportion of those. And a lot of our bull groups are in small groups and vegetative cover during this time of year. So they're going to be a lot harder to see, and we're going to miss a higher proportion of those. But it does give you an idea of at least what we counted here. And obviously there were some elk we just could not classify. They're running through the trees. We're flying 50 miles an hour, and we have a big herd of animals running through the trees. What we emphasize to everybody is the most important thing on these surveys is to get a total count. That's our most important number, and that and the covariates. So that was what we emphasized. So for Black Hills, looking at all of our management units, we're estimating 5,100 animals. This excludes the parks. These are just our management units. And here's what our confidence interval range is. When we model this, we're saying it's between 4,800 and 6,100. This is a 95% confidence interval, and maybe I'll just explain that a little bit. You know, statistics is built on the law of probabilities, and what we're saying on this is there's a 95% chance that our elk population is between 4,800 and 6,100. That's how confident we are. It's between those numbers. Give you an idea what that means. For Wind Cave, we counted 484. We did not use the model down there. That's a minimum count. That was done shortly after the hazing effort. Those animals were split up. Those animals were hiding in the trees. Model did not perform well in those conditions, so we went with the minimum count. Custer State Park, we're at about 500 animals, range between 500 and 600. So Black Hills wide, like we talked about, we're about 6,100 animals. Now when we started this, obviously some of the Black Hills goes into Wyoming, and ideally we would have been able to fly the entire Black Hills, not just South Dakota. We would have been able to fly Wyoming too. And we did try to coordinate that with Wyoming Game and Fish, but unfortunately they weren't able to pull together the funds to do that on short notice here, so we weren't able to get that done. We knew of a few places where there were some concentrations of elk. We spent a couple hours, jumped over into Wyoming on some of the hot spots and counted about 240 elk. Some of the field staff over there, I think there were a couple of groups in the 200 to 300 size that we weren't able to get to yet. So bottom line, it's an unknown number over there. We do have movement back and forth between Wyoming, so it'd be nice to get a better handle on that, but we're looking at least 500 or so elk, at least in those couple areas we were looking at. Now we rely on our fall herd composition counts for our calf ratios and our bull ratios. This year's bull ratio was 28 bulls per 100 cows, which is about what we've been seeing the last 3 or 4 years. You can see we've kind of bounced back and forth there. These 4 years we've had over 1,000 animals classified. We feel like this is a really good sample. It's a really good estimate from the ground. We're comfortable with that. I would ignore this, but these are the data we have, so I'm going to put it up there. We had a sample of around 300 or less than 300. I don't think we've ever had 60 bulls per 100 cows back in 2008, but we think we're running for the most part around that 20 to 30, which is plenty of bulls per 100 cows. One of the things I want to talk about here before I finish up is our population models. I'm sure some of you on the commission remember us talking, John and I talking about this last year. We were predicting that we were going to be around 4,000 animals, or we were around 4,000 animals in 2012, and we felt like the population was making the turn, coming out of the down and starting to climb up again. Obviously, now we're estimating 6,000. Obviously, we were being conservative. Our model was a conservative estimate. What we're going to do is in the near future here is try to go back and back calculate a correction factor on our models and our population estimates. We're going to give it a shot and try to come up with a scientific way of doing it. I'm not going to try and fool anybody. That's going to be filled with a lot of assumptions, but we're going to give it a shot to try and give us at least a better idea. When we were back here at these way too many elk numbers, and we thought we were around 6,000, you know, between 6,500 and 7,000 maybe. How many elk was that really? Was that more like, you know, 8 or 9,000? We want to be able to try and put a number on that so we know at least how many is way too many. So we're going to attempt to do that. Again, for some of the new commissioners here, this is our population estimate. I wouldn't be hung up on the numbers like we just talked about, but it's the trend information that we really rely on here. Our population grew and grew and grew. It was about the mid-'80s we really started managing for elk in the state. As you can see, shortly after it started to grow, and then we really harvested the elk population by intent. We had way too many elk back here, and we brought it down, and now we believe we're turning the corner and starting to see some more elk. So I did put up the cow harvest there just for historical purposes here. You can see where we're at. We're harvesting as many cows as we were back in the early to mid 1990s, so we've really backed down on cow harvest. Last thing I want to talk about is our elk management plan. We're going to take a run at our elk plan next. We've been revising several of our plans, and the elk are next on the list. We're in the stages of gathering together some of our historical documents and putting those together and coming up with an elk management plan that we can manage for elk in the future with. Obviously, we're going to cover some history on that. We need to update all of our research. We've had some great research in South Dakota here. We've got some great population characteristic information to use, such as survival rates and for cows and calves. So we have some good information there on recruitment too. And obviously we have some good information to put in this plan on our survey methods as well, our aerial survey. So we're going to update our survey techniques and look at our harvest strategies. And we're going to adjust our population estimates and our models. Like I mentioned, we're going to attempt to kind of back calculate that, if you will. But one of the things I did want to emphasize is we're going to go back and look at our elk population goals. And I know some of you have heard some of this as of recently. Back in 1996, when we worked with the Forest Service, we had an elk population goal of 4,500. And this is on Forest Service land in the Black Hills. The Forest Service here, back in the year mid-2000s here, they did a EIS. So their EIS on their Forest Service plan reinstated this goal of 4,500 elk on the forest lands here. Last year, if you remember, at the commission meeting, we estimated we had about 4,000. That was 1,000 in the parks, so we estimated we had about 3,000 on Forest Service land. And we stated we thought we should get to about 5,500, which means about 4,500 on Forest Service land and 1,000 between the two parks. That was our goal that we stated there. So we need to go back and reevaluate that. Now that we have a complete aerial survey of the Black Hills in South Dakota that's never been done before, we have a new number to look at and evaluate whether or not 5,500 is the right number. We need to assess that. So obviously we need to work with the Forest Service, and we've started some of those discussions. We obviously need to involve the public on this, and we need to consider habitat. If we continue the drought, that's going to impact numbers we can manage for. And we also need to try and get a better handle on elk movements, because we know we have elk move back and forth between us and Wyoming, and I think that's an important thing to consider. And I'll leave the last thing here, and these are just some of the things we're going to touch on in the elk management plan. Not everything by any means, but one thing we really want to do is evaluate our elk depredation program. Staff met a couple of weeks ago to start this process. Maybe there's some things we can think outside the box here and look at ways to try and increase that social tolerance of elk and reduce some of the depredation we see in the Black Hills, so we can manage for perhaps bigger numbers. And with that, I'll turn it over to John for some more survey information.
Back to me. Just a couple more slides here and we'll be finished up. We showed you some information last month, the calf ratios, and of course all this information that Andy passed on to you here today. The one last little bit of piece of the puzzle, if you will, or last bit of information that we look at when bringing season recommendations to you is our elk tooth returns. So we do ask all of our hunters that harvest an elk to submit the lower two middle incisor teeth from their elk so that we can age those. And we age by wear to those incisor teeth and give a estimate of where we think, how old we think that animal is. And in particular, we're looking at the bull elk age structure. This is important to us to see what are we harvesting, first of all, but what kind of opportunity might we be offering out there. And as you can see from the 2012 data, predominantly, 53% of those aged bulls are 4+. And so 4+ is that break that we consider to be a quality animal, or typically a 6-point or better, and a fairly heavy rack. To some folks, you could say a trophy, but those are the bigger, mature bulls. The 2- and 3-year-olds are typically your rag bulls. Usually, 4 or 5 point, pretty spindly racks. To some people, a really quality animal, though. And then, of course, you have your yearlings and calves in here. So this is, as I mentioned, another bit of information that we can use as another look at the population and to determine where we want to go with harvest recommendations. And so the last slide I have is to just present to you, and I know you folks have probably been able to see these, but what our recommended changes to proposals are based on the new information from the aerial survey that we have. Before I mention those, though, I would like just give you a brief overview of our units again, and where we're at maybe for some of the new commissioners as well. So just briefly, Unit 2, as Andy had pointed out in a few other slides, is our biggest unit and predominantly public land. We do have a few private landowners up in this area here, down along the Wyoming border, and we deal with a little bit of damage on those folks, and some of them would tell you a lot of damage, but predominantly public land. Predominantly public land up here in Unit 1 as well. We get into a little bit of private up here to the west of Spearfish, the bench as they call it. And Unit 3, the north half, predominantly public land, just a bit of private over to the west, and the south half is more private than public, definitely. And then taking you east along Wind Cave and Custer State Park, we have Unit 4 and Unit 9. These are basically all private land. There's very little public land in these units, and so that's very important when we look at harvest recommendations and where we want to see these elk herds go. They're shaded because currently we have closed the season in those 2 units. That's based on our estimates of population. Of course, the aerial survey confirms some of those thoughts this year. You remember that we showed a 0 count from the aerial survey for Unit 9. Now, as Andy mentioned, we do know there's a few elk in there. And of course, we counted a few elk down here in Unit 4. Just finishing up, Unit 5 is a predominantly public land unit, and we call it a wilderness unit, if you will. And the reason we say that is its accessibility is very limited in Unit 5. If you want to hunt that unit, typically you're going to have to hike in and plan on packing your animal out. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Unit 7 here. And that's about 60% public land, about 40% private. So it's kind of unique in itself. And we do have, when our elk populations are high, do have some depredation issues on these private lands running right up along I-90 here. So just a brief overview of those units. And then jumping right on and wrapping up for you folks, our recommended changes to proposal are to increase the any elk licenses in Unit 2 to 250. So we asked and you proposed 200 any elk licenses, and so we're asking you to increase those by 50. Likewise, we would like to see a similar increase in the archery licenses, any elk licenses for Unit 2, take those from 40 to 50. And then lastly, we're asking that you bring the Unit 1 license allocations back to the 2012 numbers. We did propose a slight decrease, but having the new information and the counts that we do from the aerial survey, we would ask that you bring those back to the 2012 numbers. And with that, Andy and I are prepared to take some questions. I would just, for your information, point out that this is a group of bulls that we counted in Unit 2. A lot of folks look at this and think these might have come out of Wind Cave, but the fact is that's a group of Unit 2 bulls, and as you can see, there's some pretty nice bulls in that group there. Thank you.